Hello and welcome to New England Authors. So good to have you with us. We're exploring all kinds of issues, and today we have a wonderful guest and a wonderful issue. Our guest is Leigh Swigart, Director of Programs in International Justice and Society at Brandeis. Welcome to the show. And you wrote this wonderful book. You co-wrote it with Daniel Terrace and Cesare Romano, and it's the book called The International Judge: An Introduction to the Men and Women Who Decide the World's Cases. Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor writes its foreword. I thought it was just a really very interesting book. Please tell us now about your co-authors. Who are they?
Daniel Terrace is someone until very recently worked with me at this center at Brandeis. And just Cesare Romano is a professor of international law at Loyola Law School in Los Angeles. And we first came together to do this project because Dan and I had been working for a number of years on a program called the Brandeis Institute for International Judges, which is a program that convenes judges sitting on all kinds of different international courts and tribunals. And Brandeis is the only university or only organization that brings these kinds of, creates these kinds of programs.
Yeah.
And Cesare was working on something called the Project on International Courts and Tribunals. So we decided that with our interest in the international judiciary, we would come together and we would really do a project and write a book that would introduce the average reader to who these people are and why their work is important.
Yeah, I think you do just a wonderful job. You talk about the history of the international courts, and I think you begin in 1794 when there was a court founded between Britain and the new United States to sort out issues caused by the Revolutionary War. And then after World War I, there were international courts with the treaties that were formed. Where do we stand today? Tell us about the international courts that we have today.
Well, there are probably around 15 plus or minus international courts and tribunals, depending on how you categorize them.
Right.
And they have diverse jurisdictions. There are those that deal with disputes between states. By states, I mean governments or national or nation states. Like the International Court of Justice, which is the judicial, the primary judicial organ of the United Nations.
Right.
International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, the WTO, the World Trade Organization appellate body. We have courts that have human rights jurisdictions in the Americas, in Africa, and in Europe. There are also courts that deal with issues that arise from treaties and organizations of economic integration like the European Union and the Caribbean Community. And then the courts that have the jurisdictions that have the highest profile are the criminal ones.
Oh, yes.
Those are the ones we hear about. The Yugoslav and Rwandan tribunals that looked at the conflicts and the atrocities that took place in those regions. The Special Court for Sierra Leone. And now, of course, there's the International Criminal Court, which has universal jurisdiction.
Now, would it be correct to say that these international courts adjudicate based mostly on European law as opposed to, let's say, Islamic law or African law? Would that be right?
That's not really accurate. International law is a body unto itself, very distinct from national law. It's based on basically three different sources: general principles of law, customary international law, and then, of course, the treaties, bilateral or multilateral, that states sign and ratify. And then, of course, there's the statutes that establish courts that are also sources of the law that these particular courts are going to look at, like the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, or the American Convention on Human Rights, or the European Convention on Human Rights. What is accurate about what you're saying is that international law really developed in Europe. It really comes out of the Renaissance and principles of enlightenment, and through, of course, a colonial activity by European countries. This was spread around the globe, and of course, modern nation states then sign on in their own right to treaties. And so, you know, the contemporary world sees international law, all these countries are signed on to it, but it does have sort of a European origin.
And you say that most of the judges are European or American, and that there is a lack of Asian participation. Is that correct?
Well, let me explain that. First of all, most judges are not American. Hardly any of them are American, because we are not members of most of the courts in the world that are open to universal jurisdiction.
Yes.
There's only 3 Americans right now sitting on the benches of these international courts and tribunals.
Right.
Europeans are dominant because there are a couple of courts that for the European Union and for the Council of Europe that have huge benches, and each European state has the right to have a judge of its nationality. Now, Asia is an interesting situation. Asia does not have a regional human rights body. It doesn't have an arrangement for economic integration, so it doesn't have any court that is adjudicating that. So lots and lots of Asian judges sit on the courts that have universal jurisdiction, like the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, the WT appellate body from Japan, China, Korea, the Philippines, and so on. So in fact, they're pretty well represented. They just don't have their own regional set of institutions.
Now, I want to talk about the United States' involvement in this in a little bit while, but they seem to have a little less power among the powerful nations. The powerful nations don't want them to have a lot of power. For example, the United States is afraid that its military might be charged for crimes committed in Iraq and Afghanistan. China doesn't want any international body meddling in its aspirations in the South China Sea. Russia doesn't want to be held accountable for its actions in Ukraine. Does that really limit the scope and the efficacy of international courts?
Well, it does. It's always good to have the most powerful nations on board. What's interesting is that, of course, to be a member of the international community and to be a full participant in these institutions, a country has to cede some of its sovereignty. That's what this international system, since following World War II, is all about. That for the greater well-being of the global population, that states will not only think about their self-interest, but they will sort of step back and say what's better for humanity as a whole. And powerful nations don't like to cede their sovereignty. Less powerful nations often are very enthusiastic about being parts of these institutions because it levels the playing field. So yes, Russia, the United States, China, they don't want to be often part of these kinds of arrangements. They're all members of the UN, so they come before the International Court of Justice.
Yeah.
But I mean, I would say that we have geopolitics as it stands today. In 50 years, the United States or any other powerful nation could be in a very different situation, and so it's better to cede some power now and be part of a supranational system than to go home and not want to play this game at all.
This is our New England Authors here. We're talking with Leigh Swigart, a very interesting discussion on the international courts. So you've been to The Hague. Right. In fact, you just came from there.
Just came there 2 days ago.
Yeah. So it's a coastal town right near Rotterdam in the Netherlands. It's a small town, and it became a center for international justice after World War I during the League of Nations era, didn't it? Can you describe what it's like, what the buildings are like? What's it like to be there?
The Hague is sort of a kind of a staid administrative center full of bicycles. Rains a lot.
Bicycles are ubiquitous in Holland. It's really wonderful. Yeah.
Exactly. The Hague it's interesting. It actually predates World War I when The Hague became a center of international law, because at the turn of the 20th century, late 1890s and early 20th century, there were a series of conventions called the Hague Conventions that had to do with regulating warfare.
That's right, yes.
And then there was the Permanent Court of International Justice that was created by the League of Nations that morphed into the International Court of Justice, which is the principal judicial organ of the United Nations, and it's in The Hague. And I think from the establishment of the ICJ there, the Dutch government has become very, very supportive of international justice. So after the events in the Balkans in the 1990s, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia was established there. Mm-hmm. After that, there was the ICC, the International Criminal Court. There's also the Special Tribunal for Lebanon. There's a criminal court that's looking at the assassination of Rafik Hariri, the prime minister, and other people in a particular set of incidents. So there's also other international bodies. There's the Hague Academy of International Law. There is the Organization for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons, which we all sort of heard about with what happened in Salisbury and the Russian event. So The Hague has just become this center. It's a place where these courts can be established, and I think it's very much encouraged and perhaps subsidized by the Dutch government. I'm not sure.
Who could bring cases to this court?
Which court?
The International Court of Justice.
The International Court of Justice only looks at disputes, resolves disputes between governments.
I see.
So there's 190 plus states in the world under the United Nations. That means there's only that number of potential parties or litigants before that court. So that's really, and they can look at territorial disputes, they can look at claims that one country has had acts of aggression against another. There's all kinds, it can be a country saying that it's being polluted by another one. Those are the kinds of things that become before the International Court of Justice. It's governments that bring charges against one another. The International Criminal Court is a criminal court, as its name suggests, and only individuals can be brought before that.
I see. Now I want to ask a ridiculous question, Leigh Swigart. Tell me, can the United States bring charges against can Mexico bring charges against the United States for the War of 1846, in which the United States illegally stole land and demand that they return California to Mexico?
Well, that's an interesting question. Basically, that's the kind of dispute the International Court of Justice would look at today.
Yeah.
But that was a court that was established in 1945. Again, it's attached to the UN. UN members have to accept jurisdiction. So basically, there's not a judicial body that would have jurisdiction over that set of circumstances in the past.
So I'm glad you said that, because the countries have to accept the court, right? The United States doesn't. So anybody who brings charges against the United States, it's a waste of time.
Well, no, you don't want to confuse the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court.
Oh, I'm sorry. You're right. Yes.
The International Court of Justice, the U.S. Was just very recently, there was a case against the U.S. At the International Court of Justice. It has to do with the Iran bringing charges against the U.S. for economic sanctions, saying that the U.S. is violating a treaty of amity that was signed with Iran decades ago.
Right.
And the International Court of Justice, it ruled against the U.S. and Mike Pompeo promptly said, we're not going to pay any attention to that ruling.
And is there any force that the UN can bring to bear on the United States?
So something interesting about this system of international courts is that they issue binding judgments, but they do not really have enforcement or compliance mechanisms. These are international courts. They don't have armies. They don't have standing armies. They don't have police forces. So if a country is to maintain the status of a member of the international community in good standing, then they should respond and they should respect the judgments of a court like the International Court of Justice. And by and large, they do. So it may be that, that the Trump administration may say, we don't care what the ICJ says, but in a successive administration, they may turn around and say, we need to do that. So sometimes it takes time.
Yeah.
Now, if you look at a court like the International Criminal Court, which the U.S. is not a member of, this is a court also, of course, it needs the cooperation by lots and lots of governments to get its work done. It needs to have suspects extradited to The Hague. It needs documents to compile evidence in cases. And sometimes this is not forthcoming, even by members of the ICC. And a obvious example is that the president of Sudan, Omar al-Bashir, has had an arrest warrant out for him issued by the ICC for more than 10 years on charges of crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. And he has visited numerous members of the ICC who have not arrested and extradited him.
Interesting.
In general, the United States has been a very enthusiastic supporter of institutions of international justice.
That's good to hear.
It participated in a really substantial way in the Yugoslav and Rwandan tribunals, sending expertise. There were lots and lots of Americans that were involved in the work of those tribunals. It has not wanted to be a member of the ICC, but I have to tell you, you go into the ICC and it is full of Americans. They are working in the prosecutor's office. They are really active on defense teams. So the fact that the U.S. is not a member of that court, has not signed and ratified the Rome Statute of the ICC, does not mean there is no American participation. There is a really dedicated and experienced group of Americans who are very much behind what we would call the International Criminal Project.
Okay, we're talking with Leigh Swigart. This is New England Authors. Really interesting subject about international law and international justice. And you talk a lot about the judges themselves. There's quite a number of sections where you feature one of the judges. And I walked away after reading that, I walked away with a feeling that many judges, or maybe most judges, are very competent and very skilled, and some are less competent. Would you agree with that?
Well, I mean, let's face it, every court in every country is going to have some duds, right?
Yes. And also, every country is trying to push their particular people into courts, right?
So in a way, those are two different questions.
Yeah.
Countries do like to have their citizens, their nationals, on the benches of international courts and tribunals.
Right.
And as I said before, in some cases, in the European courts, some of them have the right to have one of their nationals on the bench. Governments often misunderstand what the role of their national judge is on the bench of an international court. This is not a person who's there to defend the interests of their state or to go to bat for their state.
Right.
They are impartial. They take oaths of impartiality. Just like any other, and independence, just like any other judge around the world. So that doesn't mean that pressure isn't sometimes put on those judges from their home governments to sort of be the good boy, be the good girl, and do what you need to do to defend our country. And that's one of the reasons, and this is a development since this book was published, lots of international courts and tribunals are transitioning to a system where a judge will have a single non-renewable term, let's say 9 years.
Yes. And
that means that judge doesn't have to worry about pressure being put from the home government, which is, of course, putting that person forward is nominating these people or putting them up for re-election.
Yeah.
So this sort of cuts out that problem that they would feel that pressure. So I think in some ways courts really need to understand, governments really need to understand that having a judge of their nationality on a bench isn't sort of like,
yes,
a pass.
Yes, yeah. So you talk a little about whether a court can create law, and you cite a court's refusal to weigh in on nuclear weapons issue. What about important questions like climate change, global warming? Do you think the court should be stepping in on that?
Courts, international courts can, like other courts, can only take cases that come before them through particular sets of procedures and rules. So a court cannot, in its own initiative, weigh in on even the most pressing issue if it's not a case that's been brought before it. The International Court of Justice did have a case in the 1990s that had to do with, it was an advisory opinion, a non-binding advisory opinion, that was about the legality of nuclear weapons. And it did sort of sidestep and was very diplomatic in saying, it declined to say that nuclear weapons should be illegal under any circumstances. So in other words, it sort of left the window open. So let's look at climate change. Is there a court that would look at some of the issues of climate change?
Yeah.
Not really. There are people who have said, international lawyers say, we need an international environmental court.
Yeah.
We need a court that that we can be looking at these issues. Perhaps if there were a binding treaty around climate change and the Paris Accord is not binding, there could be a court created to then adjudicate the provisions of that treaty.
I see. The international judges who were part of the book project told you that the courts were present to uphold the community of law, to uphold the dignity of the individual, and to prevent violence and war. How are we doing?
I think that we're better off having these courts than not having them. I think it's really important that citizens of the world, no matter what their particular national affiliation, have the possibility of appealing to procedures of justice that are outside of their national boundaries. In the United States, we say, we don't need international courts. We have the rule of law. Would everybody who has come before an American court or gone through a judicial procedure say that it has been without discrimination, without any kind of bias? I don't think so. But in the United States, we are not a member of our regional human rights court, which is the International Court, Inter-American Court of Human Rights. So our citizens don't have a higher court to appeal to. I think that by and large, the people who serve on the benches of international courts and tribunals are extremely dedicated. They're very knowledgeable.
Yes.
They choose to spend years away from their home country in order to serve on these benches, and they sometimes sit on cases that are very difficult, particularly the criminal ones. And they are trying to create a better world. And I think that all of us should support international institutions more generally, and courts in particular, because we all have a stake in protecting and in being part of a very fragile planet. Yeah,
I walked away from reading your book with that impression, that they were very competent and that this was a wonderful thing that we have and that we should increase it. Now, you're trained as an anthropologist. What got you involved in international law?
Well, it was kind of a fluke. I'm trained as a linguistic anthropologist, and I lived in West Africa for a long time. And I think I came into this job more through my international experience, certainly not through my legal experience, because I'd never done legal studies. So it was quite a steep learning curve for me. And it continues to be one. I always feel challenged by the work I'm doing and feel that I really need to educate myself. So I've really enjoyed it. And I have to say, the international justice field is full of lawyers, which is not surprising. So being an anthropologist often carries with it a certain cachet.
Yeah. Now, we're just coming up to the end here. So in the conclusion, you state that the future of the international courts is uncertain. You wrote that some years ago. Is that still the case, that it's uncertain?
International courts are currently getting a lot of pushback from national governments, in lots of different jurisdictions. And it was interesting in our most recent Brandeis Institute for International Judges, which was in May 2018, the judges chose to work collectively on drafting a statement that was called the Oslo, took place in Norway, the Oslo Declaration for Enhancing the Legitimacy of International Courts. And the whole idea is that they need to demonstrate to the governments that support them and pay the bills and bring cases and are members, that they can do their work, that they are serious, that they're institutions that are really, really important. Because international courts, it's not like a national court that can assume the support of a government. They have to prove themselves day in and day out that the work they do is important. And it is.
Well, thank you so much. This is New England Authors. We've been speaking with Leigh Swigart. Her book is The International Judge. We record here in Cambridge, broadcast on stations throughout New England. Remember, watch locally.